and welcome to the Natural Lands Ecosystem and Invasives Management Workshop. I'm Rella Abernathy, and I work for the City of Boulder in Colorado, where we manage 47,000 acres of open space land. And although we have an incredibly talented and dedicated staff of ecologists who are responsible for managing this land, invasive species management of natural lands is one of the most challenging and most complicated issues that we face. Since plants are the foundation of ecosystems, maintaining native plant communities is a goal for natural land managers. It's also important to keep in mind how other organisms are impacted, including invertebrates, reptiles, birds, amphibians, and aquatic life. As ecosystems are undergoing rapid change from a number of factors, many outside of our control like climate change, it makes our job even more difficult. Each of us can also get conflicting advice from different experts and peers. So whether we're using mechanical control, mowing, pulling weeds, grazing, or burning, or using chemical herbicides, how do we know if it's effective? And maybe the bigger question is, how do we know if our goals and objectives are reasonable to achieve in this unpredictable time of massive environmental change? Whether we choose to do nothing or put a lot of resources into an area, there will be consequences to the plant communities and other parts of the ecosystem. Though we're obviously not going to be able to answer all these questions today, or maybe ever completely, maybe what we can do is get a better understanding of the questions we should be asking ourselves as land managers to help guide our decision-making process so we can be as effective in our management goals as possible, as well as taking into consideration the broader impacts that our decisions can have on biodiversity loss, particularly of native species complexes. So we have a great panel of ecologists today to share with us what they've learned from their many years of research and experience. They come from different regions of the country, and they are all top researchers in their fields. What they share in common is a broad ecological perspective that is really critical if we're going to make the best decisions in land management. We're going to start with brief presentations from Drs. Seastedt, Rypstra, and Blossey, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Please enter your questions in the chat or question window. I'm really excited to hear the perspective of Ann Rypstra from Miami University in Ohio. Ann is a professor of biology as well as the director of the university's Ecology Research Center. Ann's research focuses on spider ecology, including their interactions with their prey and how they communicate through chemical cues. She's also looking at the impacts of anthropogenic chemicals, including pesticides, on the physiology and behaviors of spiders and other arthropods, including the effects of some of the most commonly used herbicides for weed management. So want to take it away now, Ann?
Well, thanks everyone for coming, and I'm sorry that people are having technical difficulties. It always has to happen at some point. I'm really honored to be part of this conference. It's been really interesting and fun to hear the talks over the last few weeks. And what I want to talk about today, just give you a brief introduction to some of the unintended consequences that ecosystem managers face as they when they use pesticides in natural systems. And as Rella said, I work with spiders, and spiders are important predators in agricultural systems or in terrestrial systems throughout the globe. They eat predators, or they eat insects, and they eat predators. They eat one another. So all of those things are key factors in spider ecology. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the signaling in spiders. And all spiders produce silk. They deposit feces and pheromones in the environment, and these chemotactile cues expand their influence in the food web. And so those are the kinds of questions that we've been asking in my research group is, what are those chemical cues doing? And not surprisingly, chemical cues influence spider reproduction. So there's a dialogue between spiders in mating interactions and the interactions between males and females. So even in spiders that have a dramatic visual display, they are communicating chemically. More important to some of the food web issues is that chemical cues help spiders identify prey, so they can identify the species, even the quality, so they can discriminate between a fruit fly, a high protein fruit fly, and a low protein fruit fly, based on that chemical signature. Also, the familiarity of that prey, whether they've eaten it before. There are dynamics between spiders and predators and amongst predators that allow chemical information to help them identify the size or hunger level or diet of a potential predator. And that dynamic is really important in a lot of the food web interactions we see with spiders. More important to the food web, perhaps, is that these chemical cues impact the food web directly. So I can take a spider and let it walk around on a leaf, and a Japanese beetle, a Mexican bean beetle, many other herbivores will eat less of that leaf than they would a leaf that a spider had not been in contact with. And also that linkage, the linkage between the green food web, the above ground food web, and the brown food web, the below ground food web, is also impacted by those chemical cues. So in that same way, I can let a spider, a wolf spider, walk around on the surface of the soil and see changes in soil respiration and nitrogen levels because of changes in the behavior interactions of the soil arthropods in response to the chemical cues, the silk and feces and excreta of the spiders. So what does this have to do with pesticides? So a lot of people have cited Rachel Carson, of course, and she's certainly inspirational to our understanding and our concern about pesticides. But what drove my research program, and perhaps why I'm here today, is a quote that Bob Holt said: anthropogenic influences on information transfer are the next depressing frontier in conservation. And basically, he was probably thinking of light pollution or machine noise, those kinds of things. But what my lab grasped onto is the idea of info disruption. And this is analogous to endocrine disruption. Many of you heard Tyrone Hayes earlier talk about how anthropogenic chemicals can affect chemical information transfer within the body. Info disruption is the same idea, although these anthropogenic compounds are affecting information transfer outside of the body and between and among organisms. And so if I look at the same array of behaviors that I outlined for spiders, we find that herbicides, we've worked mostly with atrazine-based herbicides and glyphosate-based herbicides, reduce the efficacy of courtship display. So even in species that have a very visually dramatic courtship, that doesn't work as well in the presence of herbicide. It makes it difficult for males to find females and to identify the quality of females in natural systems. They change spider activity patterns, which then changes the pattern with which the spiders produce these cues and these signals that influence the dynamics. And that changes then again the predator-prey dynamics, and who wins and who loses shifts. So we have different winners and different losers in predator-prey dynamics. And this actually is a transgenerational effect. So the offspring of females that have been exposed will have some impacts. And herbicides also uncouple those links between the above ground and the below ground food web that we've uncovered and cause them to be much more dynamic and random and unpredictable. So all of these things mean that there are dramatic differences in the roles of species in these boxes and the way these boxes interact in a food web. There's differential reactions to different herbicides and when they're applied during the life cycle that are going to shift then the ability of certain groups and the diversity of the system to cope and to respond and to maintain that semi-natural ecosystem integrity. So that's my contribution, and I appreciate your being here to listen to me.
Thanks, Anne. Tim, are you able to share your screen now? It looks like you're on mute.
There. I will try once and see what happens. And if it fails, then I'm going to wing it. And it failed. So I shall wing it. It's all right. We're only going to do a 5-minute overview. We can do this verbally. So first, I also want to thank you all for the opportunity to share some thoughts about non-chemical controls of invasive plant species. My studies have involved the biota of the grasslands and foothills of the Colorado Front Range. And as with many sites in the West, this region's becoming more arid and more fire prone. And it's within that context then that we have to do our studies of invasive plant species. The Front Range is the host of many numerous problematic invasive plants, many of which are regional problems throughout the Western US. And if I had my slides here, I'd quickly run you through the sort of the way I walk through our research on developing and testing biological controls for their efficacy on preventing noxious weeds. Lacking that, we'll just simply say that an invasive species gets into an area and it becomes established. And then its outcome is, well, it could be rare, it could be common, or it could become a dominant or almost super dominant. And it's those super dominants that we go after because we see them as having negative impacts on the species of concern that we desire. And so a species is capable of doing this because it's able to launch through a variety of abiotic and biotic filters. It has to jump through a climate filter, a soil filter, and a disturbance filter for each community that it gets in on. And if it's capable of doing that, then it has to deal with the biotic community. And within the biotic community are the enablers that actually facilitate its abundance, symbiotic fungi that can enhance it, service providers in the soil that provide nutrients. But then it also has to deal with the inhibitors, if you will, the pathogens, herbivores that can destroy its tissue, and then the plant that can actually play a major role in preventing it from accessing the resources that are on the site. So classical biological control manipulates what's available there to see what could control the species. So what we've done is historically tested out the pathogens and herbivores that have been approved and known to be effective on these species and not known to harm any North American species, and let them go and simply watch the outcome of these events. And within that context, then one is able to manipulate the plant community composition to see the extent to which plant competition can then affect this outcome. And so over this 30-year period of playing with these, we've had everything from complete success, where we've essentially taken a super dominant species and made it into simply a disturbance specialist, a roadside weed that is no longer or has any threats to our conservation values or to the economics of a cow pasture. And we've had so far some complete failures to date. The latter one, if you're familiar with cheatgrass, is an example. So we keep doing this, but once a species becomes regionally abundant, we've essentially defaulted into this mode. Herbicides cannot do the job once you've got a regionally abundant species. We've got to find something that can control them at essentially no recurrent costs. So if I had my slides, I'd give you my 4 bullets that summarize this 30 years of effort. The first one's a sad one, in that monitoring is yet to emerge as a standard management practice, even though we knew that going in. We knew that decades ago. Is not the impetus to get the data, and without this information, management's really trouble. The second point is invasive species bring both benefits and penalties. We tend to focus on the penalties, but ironically, those benefits are out there and often unstudied and unmentioned in the discussion of the management of these species. Invasive species really are more consequences than causes of change. They come in because of a disturbance of some sort, but once they become established, then they can cause further change on their own. An important thing to remember there is those further changes can be beneficial as well as harmful, and need to be evaluated and studied and monitored. And then finally, the few invasive plant species by themselves are threats to native species and services. Their problem is they interact with climate change and with other disturbances to cause threats to our native biological diversity. And the other thing is that within the range of these regionally abundant species, they tend to really only be concerns in a subset of the habitats that they occupy, and knowing what those habitats are that would allow us to focus management activities and reduce some chemical use that's going on out there. So thanks for this.
Yeah, I'm so sorry we're having all these issues because it would be great to see the slides. We're going to have Bernd Blossey, who's a professor at Cornell University, speak next. He's also the director of the Ecology and Management of Invasive Plants program in the Natural Resources Department. And Bernd studies biocontrols of weeds as well as the impacts from multiple stressors on native organisms. He's conducted a wide variety of studies, and he uses that information to help practitioners develop best management practices. So I don't know if you're going to have any better luck than Tim. But we'll wing it.
You see me smile about the luck that I do not have today. So we'll work it in the same way as Tim. I'm going to read things off my PowerPoint that you all will not be able to enjoy. But it's reasonably simple because what we're focusing on is the discussion afterwards of some of the bones that I will throw to the crowd and the panelists here. But once again, thanks for having me, for inviting me to this forum where I'm agreeing with Tim that pesticides are not the solution. They are part of the problem, as Anne so eloquently laid out, and she had just a few moments to highlight a few things, right? So that are of concern in the conservation community. My work happens to be in landscapes of the northeast of North America, working both in forests and in wetlands where I have my start. I themed my first slide, the holy grails of invasive plant management, right? So what are they? And so Tim highlighted a few things where he and I just completely agree, and even the people that will be watching this at a different time, unfortunately, will not see the slides, so they need to write down whatever we say or what comes out of the conversation. But the first core knowledge that we need to have is what are actually the impacts? What are we worried about? Because the plant species per se, because it's from South America or Europe or Asia or whatever we have, is not the problem. What we're trying to prevent are negative impacts that are maybe caused by high abundance or phototoxicity or whatever else we have. The question then is, and Tim again highlighted is, what are the mechanisms that are actually causing a deterioration in the ecosystems that we are stewarding somehow? And is the plant really the cause of deterioration? And Tim was pretty bold in saying there very rarely are. I happen to agree with him the longer I study this, that the plants are very rarely the issue. Very often it's some other things that are of overriding consequence. I'm a strong believer in climate change, although I do not think that climate change is the major threat to conservation in the way that some people make believe it. I think there are other stressors, I call them stressors, that are at least of equal, if not more importance. And the couple that I've listed here on my slides are earthworms, at least in our area. The vast majority of it are introduced in the Northeast. Browsers and grazers. Where Tim sits, it's cattle and elk and maybe even mule deer in some places. Where I'm sitting, it's white-tailed deer. Further in the south, it may be pigs. Then previous land use history, there will be history in the system and all kinds of other things. My studies and others have suggesting that there will be no conservation anywhere in the Northeast and Midwest of the US unless we get a handle on deer. If we don't, we can forget conservation and the adaptations that people, maybe people, but species have evolutionary change or migration to new places where they can live if the deer are preventing safe havens from developing or existing. Now, if we have identified that there are negative impacts and they're caused by the plants, is the appropriate management action, right? Important then is treat the cause, not the symptoms. If plants are the symptoms of other overarching problems in ecosystems, whether it's high abundance of deer or pigs or maybe climate change or earthworms, removing the plants, regardless of what method you're using, will achieve nothing, absolutely nothing. Next one, eradication, which still some people think about, is never the goal. Autumn comes to the rescue. Thank you, Autumn. I shared my little PowerPoint with her, and so she is there, so you can see it now. Much appreciated. So eradication is never the goal, and it's never achievable, except when you find the very first couple of individuals, right? Then maybe, that may be locally, but most often it's on a regional basis. And then be aware, whatever you throw at these plants of revenge effects, the impacts of management may be as disastrous as the impact of the plant itself. And highlighted some of that. And it doesn't matter what you're using, whether that's herbicide or disking, mowing, or mechanical removal, all have potential negative impacts on the species that you want to protect. Be very, very suspicious of easy solution, whether that's vinegar pouring on introduced plants or all kinds of other things, but people say, I had great success with this. It's really simple and these things go away. They never do. Advertising, right? So snake oil sales people have been around all the time. And another important thing is articulate what you want in a system, not what you do not want. We're managing for some native species, for particular species, or sometimes ecosystem function, which is a very diffuse concept, right? What does that really mean? And I work a lot with bioindicators. These are the species that we want in the systems. If they indicate to us that these places can still be good, safe havens for them to establish and reproduce, we're good. And we can talk more about that. I'm a big advocate of setting aside large enough areas, and can't be 5 square meters or something like that, where you do not do treatment interference, whether that's herbicide or mowing or whatever else you have, to understand what I here call successional dynamics. Plant species exist in places, communities exist in places, and they evolve. We typically know that from bare soil to annual plants to perennial plants to forest ecosystems in some places, right? We call that succession. That's being affected by lots of different things, including organisms in the soil, plant-plant competition, and accumulation of natural enemies, whether that's active restoration to biological control or whether they recruit from native communities. Look at that, do not interfere, and see whether these plant species go away. I have multiple examples in the Northeast where that seems to happen. Next one is do restoration, down or spraying or whatever you do. Plant the species that you want in there, and then have patience. Please be patient. There's so much activism going around that is actually backfiring right now. Be accountable. As I said, versus measuring outcomes is not helpful and prevents learning. So I need to echo what Tim said. Last slide, Autumn. Thank you very much. That's what I have. So it's the metrics of accountability. That's what I call that. And so if you want to look at that, acres treated, hours spent weeding, your financial resources expended are not good or appropriate measures of success. I constantly see that all the time, right? Expenditure, whatever. It's not a good measure of success. The ability of native species to return and thrive are good measures of success. As I said, it may require restoration or planting. The excuse that I've heard so many times that there is no time to record outcomes because all time is spent managing is inappropriate articulation of stewardship responsibilities and of your accountability if you are those that are funding or managing or overseeing staff. This needs to happen, otherwise we prevent learning and we prevent being accountable for what we're doing. I understand that agencies need to redefine their work responsibilities to actually make monitoring and accountability part of their public trust principles and their accountability. You're being funded by public dollars, sometimes private foundations. You need to come up with the metrics of what it is that you do and what the outcomes are. Funders need to link the outcome measurements with management funding. Otherwise, we have no accountability. We very often see grants being handed out just for management, not for science. That's the way that it's being called, right? Monitoring is not science. It's accountability. It's part of what we need to understand. If you throw something at a system, how does the system respond? And academics need to develop appropriate indicators because we can't just have land managers do this by themselves. That's part of what I do here. Each of these things I can talk an hour about. I do not have an hour, so I close it right here. And hopefully there's enough beef on the bare bones that we presented to have a useful discussion. Thank you very much. And thank you, Autumn.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to the audience for putting up with our
very difficult technical problems, which as difficult as they are and as difficult as figuring what for a land manager to figure out what to do. So I wanted to see if anyone had any questions. And since I don't see any, I'm just thinking about this since we're going into, at the city here, we're going into a process where we're trying to make some decisions about what types of management processes we use. When is it okay to use a chemical? Is it ever okay? How do we understand what the impacts are and the trade-offs? And some of these weeds that we're actively managing for, does it make sense to manage for them? And in some cases, we have no choice because we're mandated by the state. And so that complicates things as well. So, I'm sure that people who are actually managing lands are just confused about even what steps they should go through. So in this kind of complex environment we're in of different, having so many multiple objectives, where do you even start? Like, how do you determine whether you should be managing a certain species or not? If you're not required to do it by mandate, if you are required to do it by mandate, how do you have as little impact on your native plant community and your ecosystem as possible? Anybody have any suggestions for that? Oh, you're muted, Tim.
Well, outside of not fit all becomes the key thing here. And I'm aware of Boulder's problems since this is where I live. And indeed, the regionally abundant species need to be treated very differently than the emerging species. And there are a few emerging species that need to be contained. And the regionally abundant, and because we've studied most of them now in the Front Range long enough, I actually would pass over active management of them for some of these smaller problems that need potentially more proactive treatment. But each one, that's one size not only doesn't fit all. You hear that the idea of context matters, but even when we're working with a single invasive species, the individual the response to a management activity varies by habitat. So it's problematic, and indeed we just need to get the scientists embedded with the managers and get the stakeholders to realize that they actually can make a difference, especially with these smaller issues that aren't a million acres yet. It's surprising what volunteers can do out there in the community, and actually Boulder's demonstrated a few of those in the past.
Yeah, so go ahead, Bernd.
My hand here on this platform, and I don't have, I always need to find the unmute button. That's what Tim is telling us with as well. I wonder whether Tim has a good suggestion of whether going after what we call emerging problems, right? Whether that's not a potential wasted effort as well. So I'm not quite sure what to suggest in regards to your question. So working in the Northeast here, I know that some of the focus plants that people have very high on their radar screen, and I will name them: garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass, microstegium, swallowworts, Japanese knotweed, Phragmites are among them. I've worked with almost all of them except with, I've worked with all of them. I think of those lists that I have, only 2 I consider serious enough to go into biocontrol development at the present time. That's Japanese knotweed and Phragmites, which have their own suite of problems that are associated with that. Everything else, once you go further south, there are other things. We have strong evidence supporting that even species like swallowwort and microstegium will go away if you deal with deer, or sometimes even if you do not deal with deer and the disturbance. We do not have that evidence for Phragmites or Japanese knotweed. Continue to be strong invaders regardless of what we have. Again, it's maybe another holy grail, Tim, right? But I wonder about activism if you have things that are well established across the country and then move into the Midwest, or come from the Midwest and move east, whether that's a worthwhile effort. I'm not convinced that it is. And I see one question, if I may address that, Rella, about the roadsides, right? I don't care about roadsides unless they are planted for pollinators or so, right? So when I think about conservation values, roadsides have very little of it. While I work with departments of transportation, I'm not quite sure what to suggest. The herbicide spraying is definitely not something that I like to do, but mowing regimes are just fine to not obscure road signs, right? So that may be the thing to do in a situation like that. I understand Hawaii has very fast-growing species along roadsides. When I talk to the DOT, I very often tell them not to put high-fertility soil along roadsides. If you do very poor nutrition soil along roadsides, stuff will not grow as tall. They looked at me with strange eyes and said, "Why would you suggest that?" Because I said, poor sandy soils grow more herbaceous species versus grasses. And you have pollinator benefits in that one as well. So that's my take on that one. I'm not sure I have a good suggestion on how to sort out the ones that you should throw effort at or not.
Rella, you're not there.
She's having some connectivity issues, it sounds like, from her end. So I'll just... You there, Rella? No, okay. So she just texted me that she's having connectivity issues on her end either, separate from the swap card technical issues. So I guess I'll just jump in and, for people listening here, I imagine that they're tuned in because they're having issues in their hometown with the, I'm finger quoting here, the war on invasives and the overuse of herbicides in their town. What do you suggest for them? I mean, what do you suggest for people as they talk to their departments of transportation, their agencies that are in charge of restoration? What's a good, how do we combat? How do we get people to know that there's not necessarily a war on invasives that's dependent on herbicide?
Anybody want to go?
I'm happy to take this on because so I'm probably sitting in an area where we don't have as many weed warriors that use herbicide than when you migrate west in North America. So there's a clear distinction between the people that are charged with managing forests and prairies versus the ones once you cross the Mississippi. Things become differently. It's a much more of a weed warrior mentality, and still the thought that if you do it heavy enough and hard enough and long enough, that you will win. I would say evidence is not borne out that is a matter of fact, right? So we are fighting the same old weeds with the same old methods and just replacing one with the other. So how to affect change in those that are managing it, whether that's in urban areas or in rural areas or highways, I'm not entirely sure. But Tim's suggestion, and where I'm harping on, measuring the outcome and clearly articulating what it is that you want in a place, right? If you want highway safety, you don't need to use herbicide. You can do mowing, right? If your ability is to reduce the obscuring of tall vegetation so you can read your road signs and stuff doesn't grow across the pavement. it's clear that you can do it. It's easier running around with a truck with a nozzle mounted on the side and just spraying every couple of weeks, or every week or something like that. There's a suggestion of using steam, I think I just saw in Hawaii. That's all fine, because it's very limited in its impact. Once the steam kills, hopefully there's no permanent residue from the steam somewhere, unless you put something into the water. That change in attitude, both for the individual who is charged with managing and the agency of what they are actually willing to do, is a hard sell, but it may go with actually forcing them to assess what the outcomes are. Are you doing this, and what's the cost effectiveness? One of the things that they will look at is the bottom line on the interstate highways, because it's very expensive having a bunch of guys just driving up and down in a tractor for weeks at a time. So they reduce that. That's my only suggestion. And there are other places, maybe in urban areas. I saw a question about ground squirrels or whatever the rodent is up in the high elevation, right? Is mullein really a problem up there? Is it? I do not know. I haven't looked at the system, but very clearly understand if native plant species become more diverse by introduced species, if it's not a complete replacement, look at elk grazing, look at sheep grazing. They all contribute to the disturbances up there, right? But we always reject them as major influencers in those systems, and see whether there's actually an impact that's negative before we jump to conclusions that we need to interfere and we constantly need to do it, because we will not be able to sustain those efforts.
Okay, so I've been in and out. Sorry, I've had to completely go off a few times, and I can't see the chat window, so I will defer to Autumn if there are questions.
Questions in the
one
chat.
of the issues I think we're having, besides just what people are learning, which is chemicals, is that just everybody's stretched so thin. It's difficult to find the resources to do the type of work to monitor or to experiment, and you're under pressure from surrounding jurisdictions. So if you allow some weeds to go, then your surrounding jurisdictions are going to be upset with you. So I think that there's, a whole lot of issues, plus political issues and differences of opinion. But, Anne, since we have your expertise here, we're talking about these changes we're seeing in the plant communities, but what kinds of worrying changes are you seeing in arthropods, that are out in these different areas? Are you seeing like changes in species composition or species disappearing, that type of thing?
Indeed, we are. We've experienced what we're seeing is actually sort of an invasion cycle, or an over-invasion, where we're getting previous invaders replacing previous invaders, and so we've been documenting this cycle since 2000 with these species that come in on trucks and semis and sort of spread around in what we call ex-urban areas, those sort of large plot areas where farmland has been converted to suburban, and they call it an invasion treadmill, and so it's really dramatically affecting the. We're having a real trouble figuring out what the diversity is, because every time we go out there, there's a new species that inserts itself, and again the dynamics are changing in some of those systems. So it's really intriguing, this sort of treadmill thing that we're seeing. So that's the biggest impact we're seeing with arthropods, sort of arthropod predators.
Yeah, and it seems like we're just seeing all kinds of weird transitions, in this type of, in what you're talking about, different waves of invasion of different species, or and when I work with pollinators, use a lot, and seeing just like the phenology get off kilter for when they're emerging, or when predators are around, when prey items are, and so it just seems like a really difficult situation to sort of figure out what we should be doing, or what should we be focusing on. Now that was, one of the things that I had listed in my outline for the plan that we're working on is like, what do you focus on? Do you focus on ecosystem services and, go into the world of controversial novel ecosystems? Do you look at biodiversity as a whole? Do you focus on native species of plants, animals, and insects, or soil health, or some subset of all of it? But as land manager, really, what do you think would give us the biggest kind of bang for our buck? When we have limited resources and we're trying to do the best we can to either preserve what's there or restore, what's not.
That's in my view, I mean, that's a huge question. In our area, we have this ex-urban transition, and so everybody thinks it's good that agricultural fields are being converted, traditional agriculture are being converted to 5-acre lots. But the question is, what drives the decision of the landowners? And so we're working mostly with private lands there. And, they build a pond, and then they want the pond to be a certain color, and so they add dye to the pond to make it be a certain color. And so there's this cycle that's occurring in those exurban systems, and so there is a real open question as to whether this conversion to, these 5-acre lots where somebody plots a house in a pond, which has more forest, more diverse vegetation, whether that's actually improving the landscape or not. And it's really an open question in terms of the degree of fragmentation in the landowner decisions. So,
yeah, and one of the thanks, I just, the more you learn about it, the more complicated it is. So, it's difficult to come up with simple rules of thumb, which I think is why people just, because, they at least it's something you're doing, and nobody's talking about monitoring. People aren't necessarily going back out and looking to see if the herbicide you used is causing your native plants not to be able to set seed, which is true of the sulfonylurea herbicides, for instance. And susceptible plants, they won't set seed. Or if you're getting pre-emergent kind of issues with your native seeds, or it's just, it's time consuming to go do that kind of work. And most places don't have the resources. We're lucky that we have our own ecologists on staff who monitor and look at things, and we have scientists like Tim. How do people who are living in areas where they don't have that kind of support, or their support is mainly from like a weed management perspective, like focusing on the weed itself and killing it and not the greater ecosystem? Where do people get the information, to try to do the best they can in restoring their lands? And, it's a big and weighty question because, right now we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. So, the way we manage lands matters. And, I've seen scientists call the insect decline issue as a death by 1,000 cuts, because it's not one thing we're doing, it's tons of things that all add up that, cause problems in the end. And so, I just find it tough for us, as land managers, to know what how we should even approach something this big. And if we're better off, leaving things alone or more aggressively trying to manage, and when to make decisions, I think can be very difficult in a sea of limited information. So since we're going to get a hard cutoff at 2:45, and I keep asking you guys these really hard questions that there are no answers
questions
to,
in the chat.
We're trying our best to use our intuition, and I think that's true of people like you guys who've been out in the field for years and years, measuring things, looking at things, asking these questions, that you have an intuitive feel, even if you don't have the data in some instance. So, if we could, have you think about what you consider to be, you know, what the most important things we should be looking at first, you know, when we're in these types of management programs. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I'd volunteer, I guess. I mean, it's, to me, the ecosystem services have to take the lead because, you know, local here, we are seeing the climate change in terms of our forests are becoming meadows because of the increasing fire return intervals and the increasing aridity. Our meadows are becoming shrublands because managers simply refuse to use fire as a management tool anymore. And so these transformations is what driving the dominant structure of our plant communities in our part of the world. And within that then is the context of how the invasive species play out within that mode. I mean, our choices really are to do nothing and let it default, or be proactive and restore forward. So in these new conditions that are happening, we can impose some choices and opt for the species that we want to appear in these emerging environments. And I think that's about as optimistic as we can get these days.
Well, Tim, that also means you need to identify what the main stressors are, right? So I've been working through the chat a little bit to try to address some people's questions, because I know once we have a hard cutoff, that will disappear and we're not going to have the ability to do that. So if there are people that don't like my comments because they're controversial or otherwise I need more information, they can contact me, that's fine. But if we don't deal with grazing out west, if we don't deal with super abundant elk or sheep or goat populations in the Alpine, right? If we don't measure, then we will not know what to do. Those are some things that are forward-looking, that allow systems to recover over time with patience. If I'm thinking about the Northeast, there was just a chat here, and so we want to do tree planting and we can't do nothing about deer. And I'm throwing up my hands. What do you mean you can't do anything about deer? Okay, that's a social problem, not necessarily another problem, right? So we need to deal with that as well. We know very well how to kill deer. It's just not necessarily socially acceptable in all the environments, right? I spent probably 60% of my time thinking about how to control deer populations and how to measure that in urban and suburban environments and in rural areas. Because as I said before, there will be no conservation in the Northeast unless we get a serious handle on the deer populations. And the fuzzy, lovely wolves most likely will not help us out there, or the mountain lions, because their effect on the populations when that high is just non-existing. So it's going to be humans who will need to interfere for a while. Maybe we can drive them down to the deer populations or ungulates to a system where the wolves may be able to maintain them, right? But that fuzzy idea of bringing back the predators and everything is hunky-dory is not going to work out either. So there's a responsibility for us to deal with that. And so the big stressors, what you can affect locally, I mean, that's where Rella wants to work, right? Locally, you have decisions to make about Boulder, not about Colorado or about the US. Your decisions are about Boulder. And that's probably where most people that are on the event here will work. There are some things that you can affect locally. Climate change, you cannot affect locally. You can organize and do other things that the global environment is shifting, right? There are other possibilities. If you want to engage locally, find the pieces that are worthwhile saving, trying to protect them from the major stressors that are there, have set aside areas where allow things to just work through succession, have them be studied with community partners and with academics, and don't spray every little piece of land that there is, because these observations will be very valuable if they're merged with some assessments. And so I think my two co-panelists, they're kind of nodding a little bit about that approach. So I think we're in agreement on that one, and getting a little bit away from the activism that just throws everything that we can think of at everything that is around us. That has not served us very well. So stepping back and thinking and doing a strategic plan about little pieces, I think we will be much better served in that sense.
Yeah, I think I agree entirely. I think that the real issue in our area, is not so much what the land managers might do, but how they engage the private landowners to buy into, whether it's culling deer or shifting land use practices, because the ratio of public land that's managed is far in favor of private land that people are trying to manage sort of in an ad hoc way. And then you have the sentiment about the deer. We have a tremendous deer population too, and the focus has always been on native plant populations. We have the amber honeysuckle, which is been the big focus of shading out all the native plants. But recent research is revealing that the deer are far more impactful on the native herbaceous vegetation than the honeysuckle. So really the focus of the data have to help us educate private landowners in those contexts.
Now, does anybody else have anything else to add to the discussion about, the biggest impacts and maybe some of the steps we should take? It sounds like you all agree that, anything that's like super targeted towards one species without understanding the impact that one species has on the ecosystem is important. And we have about 5 minutes left. And Bernd, we have garlic mustard here too. And, I think your case study with garlic mustard is really interesting. If you could, tell us in a couple of minutes what you've seen in back there. I don't know if it would be true here in the West, but it could be.
Can I give you a guarantee that garlic mustard, if you take a hands-off approach, will disappear? No, I can't. I would not say that. I would be lying. I tend to not to lie because evidence usually catches you immediately in the act, right? Because people look at that. I gave a webinar on garlic mustard. People can Google that. That's archived on the New York Invasive Species Research Institute's YouTube channel. I can tell you, Rella, I have been not busy, but I have hundreds of emails because let's rephrase that. Lots of people have for decades managed garlic mustard with garlic mustard challenges, whatever else it is, right? So they have a very hard time believing that what we show, where it's scientists and land managers and students from Michigan to New Jersey, that these things are happening, right? Some people even question whether there is such a thing as negative soil feedback. So I will write email messages. I will put up things on my webpage and trying to explain that. I cannot explain that here to you in 3 lengthy Twitter messages, and I'm not going to because they will be faulty. But study it for yourself. If you're not convinced that it happens in your area, put up a test plot and let it sit there for 10 years. You can go and weed around it. If it disappears in your area, you have all the evidence that you need. But treating everything the same or saying I have a rotation every 3 years, we're hitting all the spots with herbicide or volunteers and pull all that, has not helped us to control garlic mustard one bit, except when we took the hands off and said, hey, you landowners, you can't do anything. And then it disappeared. It doesn't go down to zero, but it goes down to almost nothing, and it never had a negative ecosystem impact other than very, very temporary early on its invasion states to begin with. And probably there will be some things popping up and you say, well, we don't believe you. Well, I don't need to convince you. You convince yourself by doing the studies and actually following up of whether you actually have success in returning native plant species as you pull garlic mustard or microstegium or whatever else it is. And the evidence seems to suggest if you do not have success, but by doing nothing, we're doing better. So I don't know whether it works in the same way in Colorado. Colorado is very recent in terms of the invasion of garlic mustard. That decline that happens over 10 years is faster in the Northeast than it is in the Midwest. So there's a regional difference, right? And so maybe it will take a little longer. And believe me, patience is required. But it's also an attitude shift. Just because it's introduced and we see it as introduced, then we start wanting it out of the landscape. That's a problem that we have in our head and with our emotions. It's not necessarily an ecological problem.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's a really great place. We're going to be cut off in just 1 minute, and so I want to thank you all for taking the time to join. And I'm really sorry for the technical issues, but I think this is such an incredibly important conversation that I would love to revisit it in some other forum at some point, and where we can have more detailed discussions. And so I will follow up with all of you and see, what ideas you might have for that. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope you can see Dr. Bonsall and Ali Cohen's great closing keynote that's going to be happening in just a few minutes. So keep asking questions and working and monitoring and we'll all do the best we can with the information we've got. So thanks again, everybody, for coming today.
Thanks, Rella.